It was an ordinary peaceful day like any other. And on such a wonderful sunny day absolutely nothing foreshadowed trouble. Our hero was quietly going about his business on a busy street of his city. He was listening to music and was in a great mood, which, it would seem, nothing could spoil. As it turned out, he was only one step away from safety, which he didn't have time to do. And what happened was something that absolutely no one expected. Right in front of the sneakers of our hero ran a blue flash, which made him stop. He stared at it incomprehensibly, not knowing what it was and where it came from. After the flash right in front of him appeared a barrier separating this part of the city from everything around. Not only our hero was scared, the rest of the citizens also in a panic began to scatter, wondering what it could be, an earthquake or a terrorist attack. It turned out that this day was the last peaceful for those who were inside the barrier, which had already begun to separate from the ground. Our hero continued to stand at the very edge of the barrier and saw everything perfectly, as their barrier with a flash of light teleported to some unknown place in the middle of space. He was shocked by such events and could barely keep himself from panicking like the rest of his city. However, he was even more surprised when he looked down. He didn't understand what was happening and why a piece of his city was suddenly on top of a stone pedestal with the number 8 on it. While the terrified citizens came to their senses and wondered what it was, and were horrified by the lack of cellular communication, our hero could not believe how all that he read in novels and manga could happen in reality, spatial teleportation to another world and other nonsense. Information windows began to appear in front of the citizens like in some computer game. The poor people didn't know what surprised and scared them more. The information windows notified that the game had started and asked everyone to throw a dice. Even our hero was also a little confused. He wondered what the hell was going on, what game, what dice. It was all starting to annoy him. Before they knew it, something huge began to fall on them from above. It seemed to them that they were about to be crushed. But as it turned out, it was also a dice, but of gigantic size, and it was flying right at them. The hero couldn't believe his eyes. Was it really a dice too? Which was getting closer and closer to the barrier. After a moment, the dice fell on the barrier with the number 3 on the top edge. Immediately there was a notification from the system, which notified everyone that their figure was moving 3 fields forward. The figure shook before starting to move. If you counted from it, it should have hit the box with the shield icon. Their figure began to move quickly towards the target. The citizens were scared again, but that wasn't all, and the worst was ahead of them. Meanwhile, our hero was beginning to add up the facts 1 plus 1 and assumed that apparently they had been called into the game. Only in this game they weren't players at all. They were part of game figure 8. Which means the real players in this game were those creatures rolling the dice. Finally, their figure stopped. The hero continued to ponder, since their city was just a figure chosen by the player. It was a logical question. If the players only wanted a figure, they could probably summon a part of the city without people. Why would they need citizens? He was distracted from his musings by the next information window that appeared in front of him. It said that they had arrived at the defense field. To choose the difficulty and time of the defense, roll the dice. Just then they heard another dice roll against the barrier, with the number 1, which meant the first level of difficulty for them. It was followed by the next roll of the dice, where the number 3 was rolled, which meant for them 3 days during which they had to defend themselves. The map notification appeared, and from somewhere below the figure a section of forest and mountains began to rise to the top. And as soon as it aligned with the town, their platforms connected. The citizens didn't understand where the land had come from or what was happening, but they had no time left as the army was closing in on them. In front of them appeared windows that warned them that the defense mission was about to begin and they would need to defend themselves for 3 days. And they were given 4 key points that they needed to defend at all costs. Otherwise, after capturing the key points, their figure would lose and die. The citizens had a logical question, but what about them? If the figure dies, what will happen to them? They began to complain and demand to bring them back in the hope to influence something, but how wrong they were, not realizing in what position they are in and what their complaints and requests are worth. But this was well understood by our hero, who knew that there was no point in it and, if they had needed to, they would have contacted them initially and resolved all the issues freely. At that moment, the only thing they could do was to focus on these notices, which at that moment, told them that the citizens would be provided with the necessary equipment. And each of the citizens had been given a dice that they were invited to roll. Our hero held a dice with 100 ribs in his hand. It was something new to him. A window appeared in front of him, stating that there was a 60% chance of a normal class item falling out, a 20% chance of a magic, a 14% chance of a heroic, a 5% chance of a legendary, and only a 1% chance of a mystic class item. While everyone was looking at the dice and information windows, one man shouted that something was coming. And it definitely wasn't rescuers with the rumbling and stomping of many figures approaching them. It was an army of horrible monsters of many different kinds, armed and thirsty for blood. The citizens panicked and started running away from the barrier and calling out for someone to help. The army of monsters with a menacing roar burst into the city trying to catch up with the unfortunate citizens. And they did it very well. Used to a peaceful life, citizens were not ready for such a sprint and one by one became victims of monsters. Our hero was not an exception. One orc with a club quickly caught up with him and swung his club. His blow was so strong that our hero went flying as if he was a rag doll. And already in flight he finally understood why the men on the figure were needed, for its protection. But this understanding did not seem to help him. He flew straight into a pile of boxes in the middle of the road, which cushioned his hard landing at least a bit. Thus began a board game for their city, in which they were only required to defend the city as they progressed towards their goal and complete their missions. It was a board game of higher beings, who entertained themselves out of boredom, if they had any. After the first attempt, the orc held a bloody cudgel in his hands and was about to finish what he started looking at the still alive guy. Suddenly some shadow flew over them with a whoosh. And in a moment a flying girl with wings and a spear in her hands appeared behind their backs. She stabbed her spear into the ground and activated her skill. A fire tornado appeared in her place and began to rush towards the monsters. All the monsters that were on that street were scattered and burned by the tornado's flames. The surviving citizens looked in amazement at their savior. They were thrilled that all the monsters had died in the blink of an eye and wondered who she was. Her name was Go Haiju and she was just an ordinary citizen like them, but she was lucky as she had gotten a legendary class item, Empirical Flame Dragon Prominence's Canine, which allowed the owner to borrow the Empirical Dragon's power. She shouted for all the injured citizens to run to Namsan Tower, and for the military and police to form a defense line, and added for everyone to hurry up and roll their dice. The puzzled citizens stared at the dice in their hands, unsure of what to do with them. But since their savior told them to roll, they rolled them. She also explained to them that whatever number they rolled would give them a weapon of a certain quality. And in case they got a common class, she advised them to retreat. If they got a magical class or higher, she asked them to help her. Surprised citizens did not understand how they had weapons in their hands, but everything happened as they were told, so the words of this girl, who also saved them, could be trusted. Therefore, when a new wave of monsters rushed at them, they already with weapons in their hands ran at them in attack, trying to help her. That day, they said goodbye to their normal lives and started a completely different one. On the very first day of this new life, countless people died. But at the same time, several legendary heroes were also born, whose power could not be matched by any first-level monster so far. Meanwhile, when the whole place was engulfed in flames, our hero, whose name was Choi Yul, was still lying unconscious clutching his dice in his hand. But eventually his hand began to weaken and his fingers started to unclench. And the dice did fall out of his hand. His dice rolled around on the ground. And so here on the 8th piece he became the strongest, for he was incredibly lucky to hit that 1% probability on the dice and roll 100. However, such luck would soon lead to everyone else calling him the worst scum in the future. After all, he was given a special book called Demon King of Sovereignty, Krasina's book, which allowed him to use the library of Demon King Krasina, who desires anything and everything and gives the user access to any information such as item locations, hidden events, monster information, map and objectives once the mission starts. The book glowed with red lightning and soared into the air in front of the unconscious hero. However, the demon king Krasina, the very fulfillment of the desire for obedience, and from this one thing came out of it, which in the future will be a surprise to the others and the reason for his hatred. It consisted of the following: all rewards received by other users thanks to the information in this book would belong to the owner of Krasina's book. In the 3 hours after the defense mission started, 3,102 people died and 723 were injured. In addition, out of the 4 bases that people had to defend, 1 was destroyed. On the road that was scorched, there was a girl with a spear in her hands and flaming wings behind her. Besides, a pillar of fire was rising directly from her. It was none other than Go Haiju, who was in minor burns and scratches, who was now wondering if everything was over. A few other people who also looked shabby after the battle began to rejoice from the fact that they were able to survive and win. Suddenly, a military truck stopped behind them, causing them to turn around in surprise. A soldier got out of the truck and announced that the Korean army had arrived. After him, more soldiers started to get out of the trucks and began evacuating the wounded as well as ordinary citizens, telling them that they would take them to Namsan Tower, where it was the safest place to be. At the same time, a soldier came up to Go Haiju and saluted her, telling her that she had done a good job. She waved her hand and said that it was no big deal. He continued, saying that she had bought them a lot of time, during which the army and police were able to organize themselves and spread out. That soldier was Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong, who had a heroic rank held in Cult Inquisitor helmet. Due to the special material, the helmet user did not fall into a state of confusion, fear, or bewilderment. Go Haiju turned to the sergeant and asked if it was all over. To which he replied that the calls and internet were not working, making it difficult to assess the situation. However, adding that they were using radio communication, so they would be able to get reports from each location soon. Heading towards the car, he said that they needed to visit Namsan Tower, to which the latter agreed, following him. However, a voice suddenly sounded behind them, causing them to turn around in surprise. That voice appeared to belong to Choi Yul, who was holding a book in his hand and also saying something about this wasn't the end. He was staggering towards them. As it turned out, he had a very ragged appearance. One eye was closed, there was a cut on his forehead that was bleeding, and his clothes were covered in blood. As he came closer, he announced that the boss was going to show up soon. Then he opened the book he was holding and added that it said so. Also stating that there was also mission information, monster data, current progress and everything else. Determined to prove his words, he unfolded the book and showed it to the soldier and the girl, who stared at it in disbelief. However, after a second pause, they replied that they couldn't see anything as the pages were blank. Hearing this, Choi Yul cried out in surprise. He wondered if he was the only one who could see the contents. The sergeant replied that it was probably true. Thinking about the guy's words, Kwon Jae-yong concluded that if the guy's words were true, then the item he possessed was very powerful, since in this case, information was equal to power. Jae-yong decided to check if the guy's words were true, so he asked him to tell him more, which he agreed to do. Opening the book and turning the page, he began to read, starting by saying that the held-in helmet was a helmet of heroic rank, and one of a set of 6 items, also saying that the user's name was Kwon Jae-yong, and that he had 21 days left before he was dismissed. Then turning to the girl, he said that her name was Go Haiju, also saying that she possessed the legendary class weapon Empyrean Flame Dragon Fawn. Then surprisingly added that her favorite karaoke song was Chill Gap Mountain. Upon hearing this, the girl blushed and pointed her spear at the guy and ordered him to stop, while the sergeant noted that she had good taste. Go Haiju and Kwon Jae-yong unanimously agreed that he was telling the truth, and that the book did contain truthful data. After realizing this, Kwon Jae-yong said to himself that if the words were true, then they were really going to meet the boss. He then took out a walkie-talkie and said that since they had confirmed the item's abilities, he should contact the headquarters and inquire about further action. Watching the piece on the board from somewhere above, someone's voice reflected on the fact that he had been thinking about it all along. If this world was a game, he would most likely be a character with a bug. Since this world's problems were too easy for him. And that was most likely why they made it that way. for the purpose of keeping him out of the world. Pondering was a guy in hospital pajamas and a bandage on his head, who was sitting in front of a large hole in the wall from which a bright light was shining. Behind him, however, were a number of board games scattered about. As he continued to stare at the bright light, he said thoughtfully that if someone from above had found the bug and isolated it, then if there ever came a day when he could return to the world, then Choi Yul, the sergeant's loud voice called out to the guy, who came to his senses and immediately turned around at the voice. Kwon Jae-yong looked at the guy and said that he had received permission from the headquarters. Then, clutching the walkie-talkie in his hand, he said that it was literally a game of luck for them. However, since they had no other plan, they decided to believe his information. Afterwards, handing the guy the walkie-talkie, he asked him to provide all the information about what was going on. He replied that he would do his best. Choi Yul checked to see if he could be heard on the other end. He announced in a loud voice that he would now give information about the current defense mission. It was to protect the bases from the waves of monsters that came every 6 hours. And at the end of each one, a boss would appear. The first of which was a two-headed ogre of the first difficulty, which could use magic and melee combat. Victory was to be gained if they could defend the base 4 times a day, and if they defeated all the bosses. He then added that he had all the information about the mission, and if they used it to strategize, they would definitely be able to survive. Choi Yul also said that he would look for a way to bring them back to the normal world. Go Haiju, meanwhile, was watching the guy in front of her with astonishment and interest. Admiring and wondering that he was not only thinking about the mission, but also about the consequences. Standing still holding the book in his hands and taking a deep breath, he announced in a firm voice into the radio that he was starting the story. However, even before beginning to tell all the information, it was worth initially checking what he couldn't see while he was unconscious. Namely, that the Krasina books, from which all the information was taken, monopolized the awards of those with whom it was shared, as well as the accounts of those people. In addition, this number included not only those people who heard the information directly from the owner of the book, but also those who heard it from others, through rumors, or any other means. And any information that originated from the owner of the book, whether it was information about fighting monsters, squad building, information about bosses, or how to fight them, information about weapons and their abilities, how they were to be handled, about training, boss battles, their weaknesses, the level and characterization upgrades,